Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of the year on the Roman Society. It gives me huge pleasure to introduce Jonathan Prag from Merton in Oxford. Now, Jonathan has hit the academic jackpot. He has received funding, as you can see here, from the European Research Council, the one thing that everyone wants to. These are incredibly hard to get. And as you can see yourself, this is part of tonight's lecture, Crossreads. But you're in the fifth year of the project. I like to say myself, I'm in the 8th year of a 4-year project. So may I wish you all the success in achieving the same. Tonight is a part of a presentation of part of that project. Crossreads, multidisciplinary approaches to Sicilian epigraphic culture. Jonathan.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I have already asked for an extension of 1 year, so we'll see how it goes. But I doubt they'll give me 8. So it's a real pleasure to be here. What I'm going to try and do over the next 50 minutes or so is work you into a discussion of Sicilian epigraphy and then think about the ways that I've been trying to approach Sicilian epigraphy through first one and then a second project, and the relationship between those. So very briefly, I will set the scene with some of the challenges around doing the history of ancient Sicily. Very, very briefly allude to where we are, in a sense, with ancient epigraphy and how those two things then potentially come together to explore and use the epigraphy of ancient Sicily to make sense of the history of the island or add nuance to the history of the island across antiquity. Through a pair of projects, I.Sicily, which was what essentially provided me with the means to make the application to the ERC for Crossreads, which is a project which builds on I.Sicily. From that, I will attempt to give you an overview of Sicilian epigraphic culture, which will be, as it were, the meat of the paper, with then a series of case studies from what we're actually trying to achieve within Crossreads. Inevitably, in a 5-year project, 4 years has been almost entirely about data collecting, and we're still some way from the end of the analysing. So those results are, of course, preliminary. It's somewhat cliched now to say, but Sicily has a very particular narrative curve to it, if you like, in its history, which goes all the way back to the first, as it were, modern history of Sicily by Tommaso Fazzello in 1558, that of an island that is continuously conquered, essentially, and has no real independent history or identity, but that of its conquerors over time. Lampedusa's Gattopardo, Prince of Salina's famous speech, for over 25 years we've been bearing the weight of superb and heterogeneous civilizations, all from outside, none made by ourselves, none that we could call our own. I've always been rather fond of this quote extracted from a letter of Finlay's in discussion with Max Smith when he was composing his impressive and still unique monograph on ancient Sicily. If you start the whole story of outside alien invaders with them, by which he meant the Greeks, you're left with the obviously intolerable position that the pre-Greek Sicels, etc., are the only true Sicilians. I think we must treat the Greeks apart, not as colonialists, but as genuine Sicilians. They were there long enough. There's an essential problem throughout Sicilian history as to who the Sicilians are, whose identity we're talking about. So when you come to Roman Sicily, it's a discourse entirely about Romanization, which follows on from a discourse entirely about Hellenization, essentially. And that's always been the framing. It may help to orient you with a very crudely drawn timeline for ancient Sicily, which captures this to a degree, the fact that we go from the Archaic period with Greek and Phoenician settlement on the island through 2.5 centuries of conflict across the island, largely dominated by Carthage and Syracuse, the conquest of the island through the Punic Wars to become the first province of the Roman Republic, the long 500 years of the island's history as province of the Roman Empire, incursions by the Vandals and brief Ostrogoth rule, and then the reconquest by the Byzantines. And it carries on in that vein in that we then already from the 7th century have incursions from North Africa through to the Arab conquest in the 9th century. And the red is intended to show you the primary periods of conflict through that, and the fact that for particularly throughout most of what we might loosely call the Greek period, the island is very heavily dominated by major conflicts. And the literary grand narrative inevitably follows the pattern of those conflicts by and large, and so can be basically bookended by Thucydides' account of the Athenian expedition to Sicily in 415 BC, which gives us the famous archaeology of Sicily, in which he introduces the back history of Sicily before the Greeks got there, through to Cicero's prosecution of Verres, the corrupt governor of Sicily in the early 1st century BC, and those are essentially the beginnings and ends of the primary literary texts that relate to Sicily and give us a narrative of Greek settlement and contest for the island, ending with Roman oppression and the island sinking into, if we think back to our timeline, that essentially covers our period of conflict. And then we get to the Roman imperial period, for which there are no literary sources. Palermo, for example, major city in the west of the island, mentioned in Strabo in relation to simply the fact that there's an Augustan colony there, next mentioned in Procopius relating to Belisarius in the 530s, and nothing in between, which prompts modern assessments along the lines of both Adolf Holm, a Roman province has only a very limited individual history before he attempted to write what he could, or Venerek largely disposing of it and just saying Sicily, the High Empire, seems almost devoid of history and dealing with a small particular prosopographic problem. So we might turn to epigraphy, you'll see where I'm going, as an alternative source that gives us contemporary documentary evidence for what's going on the island. And of course, classically, it can give us direct lines into major events, but those are fairly exceptional. I deliberately picked about the two most exceptional, the Entella tablets from the west of the island in the middle of the First Punic War, and the Egedi Rostra, the Roman ship's rams, also from the First Punic War. But those sorts of points where the epigraphy intersects directly with traditional grand narrative history are still few and far between. And if we go back to our timeline, the essential point to make, loosely in a rather awful graphic, is that the volume of epigraphy increases through precisely the period of peace in the Roman Empire. Now, there are those who will point out that that coincides, of course, with the Roman Latin epigraphic habit, but it's not only that. But the majority of our epigraphy is not that sort of the Entella tablets, public decrees and so on. It's funerary inscriptions, and the majority of it belongs precisely to that long period for which our literary texts do not provide any meaningful evidence. And so the challenge becomes that of how can we use that? How can we try and use that to actually then explore what's going on the island throughout this period? And over the last, let's loosely say, 30 years, there have been a broad range of developments in how we approach epigraphic culture. None of these are necessarily new in and of themselves, but I think cumulatively there's been an increasingly sophisticated approach to using epigraphic evidence, whether that is the rise of the idea of the epigraphic habit, as coined by Ramsay MacMullen, powerfully explored for the Roman High Empire by Greg Wolfe, and increasingly developed with the recognition that it's not simply the Latin epigraphic habit, particularly visible in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, but that there are diverse epigraphic cultures in different languages and different regions, and that epigraphy is a fundamentally cultural practice, not simply a sort of one-to-one raw window onto the ancient world. And there's been what might be loosely called the spatial and material turn. We like our turns, don't we? Which in a sense was signalled by the 2012 Epigraphic Congress, which took this as its theme and is increasingly visible in works on epigraphy in the last 15, 20 years. This is, of course, not new. Inscriptions are monuments, and of course Mommsen knew that, and many others knew that, and it's largely a function of the way that they were collected and presented and recorded that the focus has traditionally been on text and less on the monument and the lack of imagery in earlier publications. But there's an increasing attention to the fact that these are much more than just a text. And perhaps we call it the linguistic turn, but the increasing focus on not simply inscriptions as evidence for language, but what those linguistic variations and changes tell us about the society that is producing them. And I've slightly arbitrarily, but not entirely, picked out particular titles that demonstrate this particularly well for the Roman West work in recent years, right through to Alex Mullen's spectacular Latin Now project on the Latinization of the northwestern provinces, another ERC project that's recently finished. So that all of these different approaches mean that there are many increasingly diverse ways of trying to approach the epigraphic evidence, and therefore, for example, to try and make more of a wealth of funerary inscriptions, for example. And there's also been the digital turn, insofar as over the last 30 years as well, increasingly inscriptions are more and more accessible and more systematically collected, which allows you to do things at scale with texts that individually might not perhaps be particularly significant, but when put into a larger context, alongside many other examples from the same region or from other regions, start to offer more information. I commend to you, if you haven't seen it, the GIS site of Latin Now, which allows you to map and explore writing materials, types of inscriptions and so on across the northwestern provinces, and has several 100,000 data points within it, and it's really very powerful. So, can we do this for Sicily? I've been wrestling with that idea for quite a long time. Started in this building 24 years ago or so. And a part of the PhD, could one just collect the evidence from the epigraphy of the island and put it together and see what sorts of patterns emerge? And this was a very crude early attempt simply to gather attestations of inscriptions in different languages across time and see what the linguistic patterns were across of just use in inscriptions on the island, with a fairly small data set of 820 dated inscriptions out of a total of 1,600 or so. And from, as it were, small beginnings, that has led to increasingly an attempt first to just collect the data, of which more in a moment, which is the I.Sicily corpus, which is essentially a digital online corpus of the inscriptions of ancient Sicily, and there's an attempt to collect all of them together in one place for the whole of antiquity. And then as a second step, as it were, inspired and developing out of that, once you have that sort of data set, what can you do with it and how far can you take it? But many of those types of analysis, whether it's linguistic or material or other, require that you have a sufficiently standardized and extensive data set to actually work with in the first place. So that not possible without that, effectively. Creating that, though, creating the corpus in the first place, is inevitably a challenge. The evidence has, of course, been repeatedly gathered over the centuries, starting with the corpus of Gualtherus in 1624. But one of Sicily's specific challenges was that because it was so close to Italy, it was kind of the first place that people went to in the corpus projects as well, so that IG and CIL are both products of the late 19th century, and neither has been revised since. And between them, they collected about 1,000 inscriptions. And there's inevitably an awful lot more. They're also in a format which is fundamentally focused around the text and very hard to use systematically and gather together without an awful lot of work. And since those were published, just about everything that's been published since is in diverse scattered places, the usual problem, but with, I don't know how far you can see this, the highlight picks out all the different references to different inscriptions across this one page of text, some of which are in CIL or IG, some of which are in L'Année Epigraphique, some of which are an inscription still unedited in Kokolos, in ILS and elsewhere, scattered all over the place, and trying just to pull that material together or to even check all of these references to see where this argument is developing from becomes hugely challenging and time-consuming. And inevitably, with the rise of post-war archaeology, the volume of Sicilian inscriptions has increased massively, and publication rates, as it were. So I.Sicily 1, which would be, as it were, somewhere around 2017, was the point where I rashly and naively thought I'd collected most of what was already published. Wasn't true, but I thought that at the time. But you can see that we've already jumped by somewhere in the order of tenfold from the 350 that were in Gualtherus at that point. And the numbers keep increasing every time I go into another storeroom, basically. So it's a challenge. And one of the advantages of having collected it all together and so on is that one can start to present the data and analyse it in particular ways. But the move from what was collected by Gualtherus, who primarily visited the key coastal cities as he went around Sicily in the early 1620s, versus what we now know of, though that's already a year out of date, in terms of the distribution of inscribed texts across the island in antiquity. But to do this properly means inevitably a very sustained campaign of systematic restudy, because by and large a lot of those texts are not sufficient, even the published ones, there's not enough data in the publication actually to work with, whether it's that the text is fully presented or any of the associated information like the actual material it's on or the object, or its current location. And so this has been a very long-running project just of autopsy, pursuit of inscriptions, and recataloguing of them around the island that I suppose I'd formally say started in 2006 in terms of from a personal point of view. And this is the brag point, as it were. That's in terms of what's been captured so far, which gets us to almost 2,500. Most of this is what you'd call museum archaeology. Most of this involves going to museums and working through what's in the storerooms, some of which will be catalogued and some of which, as every museum knows, will not be. It's a universal problem and a problem of resources. And there are key hotspots, and some of this has not been done alone. I've attempted to point to the places where various other collaborators have worked with me on this and so on. But building up, therefore, a very extensive set, not simply of where is it, but full physical description together with transcription, but also high-quality photographs, because there's an awful lot that you can't do without a decent image of the text. And there have been some specific collaborations as well. So Valentina Mignosa, who was working on the Crossreads project for its first couple of years, specifically gathered together and put into the corpus the complete corpus of the indigenous texts, mostly on ceramic, but some 500, 600 texts on sickle and Elimian. And there's an ongoing project started by the late Margherita Scarlata to actually catalogue the catacomb inscriptions, the Christian inscriptions of Syracuse, because when George Keibel did IG-14 back in the 1880s, initially he was not going to include the Christian material. At the very last minute it was decided to do so, so there's a very summary and partial high-speed gathering of a subset of the Christian material. And almost the year after he published IG-14 for Sicily in 1890, Paolo Orsi, the great Sicilian archaeologist, started excavating the catacombs, at which point we now, and the end result of that, in what are, I think, the largest catacombs outside of Rome, is somewhere in excess of 1,200 inscriptions, many of which are published, but very cursorily and in very obscure places, and have never been systematically catalogued. So there's a huge body of work in progress to try and bring that material together as well. All of which means that at the current state of play, roughly, I.Sicily boasts some 4,700 inscriptions, of which about 3,400 are on stone. Most of the ones on metal are also in there. Ceramic, as I will repeatedly point out, is extremely partial and is fundamentally archaic material, and the prospect of trying to actually capture all of the ceramic graffiti is probably one that is an impossible one, but it's a nice wish list. It embraces 7 different languages. There's a key point behind all this, that Sicily, as a multilingual island in the middle of the Mediterranean, with all those different invading peoples, is a very multilingual island. Having the Latin inscriptions in one volume, the Greek in another, and maybe never publishing the Oscan and so on, let alone the Punic, becomes a huge problem if you actually want to think about the epigraphic culture on the island as a whole. So we've got sickle, Elimian, Punic, Oscan, Latin, Greek, and about 1.5 in Hebrew, I think. Trying to cover the whole of antiquity. The starting point is kind of defined by the first inscriptions, which is in the 7th century. The end point is much more fluid, but to extent is reflected simply by the fact that the epigraphic habit largely dies out by the time we hit the very end of the latter part of late antiquity. Existing gaps that are definitely still in there. A lot of those Christian inscriptions are not yet in I.Sicily. I know of, I've probably catalogued most of the fragmentary texts in Syracuse and Catania, but they're not yet processed through to I.Sicily. There's an awful lot of resource needed to get these things through. Ceramic texts, instrumenta. One day it would be nice to have coin legends as part of this whole thing, and Punic text requires a further collaboration still to systematise those. All this is being done in EpiDoc. I'm not going to go into details on what EpiDoc actually consists of at this point. The essential point to make is that it allows one to systematically, in a very standardised and now internationally standard way, encode all the aspects of the text, both its form and its content, but also allows you to encode everything about the inscription. So everything that you would put into an epigraphic edition can be encoded in a way that a computer can use, read, process, which in turn allows you to do data analysis and all sorts of things with it. key useful things to it are that it's completely neutral about which language you put things in. So you can record Punic texts in this, I'll say, just as easily as you can in Greek or Latin, although people haven't quite agreed on all of the standards for doing that yet. But in principle, you can do so. It is standardized, it has a wide community, and it's also this word that's part of the definition of XML, it's extensible, which means to say, unlike a database, you're not constrained by your initial choices, you can keep adding more to it. So it allows you, at a future date, say, let's encode this as well on top of what we've previously encoded. So you can add in further expansions of the data that you're working on. This means that you can easily transform your data into a nice web page presenting the full edition, or a print version of that, but equally you can treat it as if it were a database and search and filter and analyze the data in the same way, which enables you to start getting things like, simple things like map visualizations of the patterns of practice on the island. And quick warning, the next part of this is going to be a whole sequence of maps, so on. So I hope they look like they're sufficiently visible just about from your side. Once one has a data set like that, then it becomes potentially possible to start thinking about things that you might do with that data set. And that was the ambition, essentially, of the Crossreads project, which inevitably was partly about trying to finish the data set itself. It's always the way. And so there's an ongoing, continuous work to improve still the content of the data, and particularly the images. But then 3 sub-packages, work packages, as they like to call them. One focused on linguistics, which was initially Robert Krellin and then Victoria Fendel working on it. One on petrography, ongoing Alessia Cocato, and one on paleography with Simona Stoyanova. And towards the latter part of the talk, I will come back to some of the specific things that we've been trying to do in each of those different areas of study. But precisely the idea to move simply beyond inscriptions and text to actually try to think about them as a whole and to contextualize them more broadly. So, if we move to an overview of what I currently think Sicilian epigraphic culture looks like, and focus at this point on inscriptions on stone, for the reason that the other data sets are incomplete, and therefore if I just add them all in, you'll get a very unbalanced picture. And I have deliberately excluded the islands, because if I was, Lipari is a whole different problem all by itself that we could have another paper on, in terms of it has 700 inscriptions all of its own, and would skew any map or data presentation one attempted to do. Deserves a lot more study, but is a separate problem in all of this. But if we think about inscriptions on stone in part as an urban phenomenon, which to a very significant degree they are, not saying that they are that and that alone, but as a proxy for, in part, for urban development, that becomes a useful thing to think about if we look at this across time. I should say a quick bit about my time divisions. Dating particularly funerary inscriptions is something of a fool's game, and extremely tricky, certainly to any narrow date range. So in almost everything that follows, I'm working with 4 fairly blunt time brackets. Archaic, which is, you will see, smuggles classical within it, for reasons which we could discuss later, but these mark, to my view, fairly clear separations within the epigraphic development of the island. So the Archaic period, which will be followed by the Hellenistic period, which is 400 to Augustus, 50 BC. High Imperial period, circa 50 BC through to, I think I said 350 AD, and then late antiquity, 350 to 700. That boundary, particularly around 350, is obviously extremely sketchy, I think it would be fair to say, and in terms of which side of that boundary many texts lie, that is quite hard to say. But if we start with Archaic Sicily, distribution of stone texts, what this, to a very significant degree, maps onto is precisely Greek colonization and, to a lesser degree, Phoenician settlement on the island. So above all, the main Greek settlements around the east and the south coast of the island, with particular concentrations in some of the key colony sites like Megara Hiblea or Selinus. Motia is the outlier with the Punic inscriptions in this context. That changes when we move to the Hellenistic period, when essentially I would argue what you see is the massive urbanization of the island at this point. And for instance, the north coast this is the point from 400 BC onwards when we get urban developments across the north coast, but also pushing up into the interior. But the change in the epigraphic culture clearly marks that expansion of urbanization across the island. That changes again when we move into the imperial period, where it becomes a primarily coastal phenomenon, and the south coast increasingly drops out of consideration. So notwithstanding that Agrigentum is going to go on to become a colonia at the end of the 2nd century and so on, minimal presence, and the whole area of ancient Gela, Camarina and so on, almost nothing along the south coast. You might say this fits Strabo's descriptions of Eremia and so on extremely well for this part of the island. And as we move into late antiquity, it looks to a degree not dissimilar to where we started, in that we reconcentrate back into particularly the southeast of the island, with a much weaker practice across most of the rest of the island, and very little indeed in the interior. If we break this apart crudely in terms of language, grey is languages other than Greek or Latin, blue is Greek, and orange is Latin, in this with our 4 time periods again, where essentially what one sees therefore is a much greater diversity of linguistic practice in the early period, a reduction to almost nothing but Greek through a large part of the Hellenistic period. Of course, we're talking about what people choose to inscribe, not necessarily what people spoke. Plato was convinced that Sicily was going to turn into an Italo-Oscan-speaking region in the 4th century, but we only have about 5 Oscan inscriptions from Messana. Clearly there was more Oscan being spoken across the island, with a lot of Campanians, amongst others, on the island. You see the major transformation of the imperial period, with the really spectacular arrival of Latin, which, as we'll come back to, despite 250 years of republican provincial rule, makes very little impact in the early period of Roman conquest, and the shift back to a predominance of Greek in late antiquity, which has, up until this point, I think, been largely under-recognised by and large. But Greek, as it were, never goes away and becomes again the dominant epigraphic language, at least in late antiquity. Quick sort of excursus into a couple of non-stone phenomena and practices, because they do present very particular epigraphic practices and cultures. One is the use of lead. Sicily is very distinctive for ancient diffictiones. It has a very substantial major early tradition of 5th century curse tablets, many of them earlier than the Attic ones. And that corpus has not quite doubled, but in the last few years, the necropolis excavations in Himera have produced somewhere in the region of another 50 to 60 lead diffictiones, only 2 of which are so far published, but the rest will come. The map attempts to capture this, but it's a distinctively, by and large, Greek phenomenon, and it's either diffictiones or it's institutional documents at a lower level. So in Camarina, this is a lot of civic tesserae for civic organisation and so on, but largely confined to particular coastal sites. Very interesting contrast with the use of bronze as it is attested epigraphically, which again is not in Sicily a Latin phenomenon. There's 3 in Latin, which are tiny fragments, but all of this is by and large Hellenistic Greek on the island, and produces some very spectacular results. There's a good case to be made that Sicily has a very distinctive and strong use of bronze. One of the things that's nice about the bronze material is it highlights, I think, very clearly one of the underlying problems with all of this, which is that part of what I'm showing you, of course, is just the accident of survival. It's also the accident of publication and so on, and discovery. But I don't think it's true that bronze epigraphy was a predominantly inland phenomenon. I think it would be a reasonable assumption that there was a lot of this in the coastal cities. But bronze, of course, is one of the easiest things to melt down and reuse as we move through antiquity, so on. So the survival pattern of the bronze material, almost as it were the opposite of either the lead or the stone, is not, I think, a representation of a different epigraphic phenomenon, but in this case a representation of a survival problem. And the large blobs tend to represent particular caches of material that have been found often by metal detectorists. Ceramic, as I gave a caution earlier, predominantly reflects the archaic material and is a very partial set of material, which again is why it looks like this, because what this is predominantly the material recording sickle and Elymian, and therefore reflects inland epigraphic practices rather than the main Greek coastal cities. So that really is giving you instead a map of work that we've done rather than any phenomenon either of survival or of epigraphic culture. But trying to bring all that material together and to do so in a standardized way with a greater flexibility where we can code things to say, well, it might be Elymian or it might be Greek, rather than forcing the decision when we only have a few letters, potentially opens the door to a much better study of actually what's going on with these very partially preserved indigenous languages, sickle and Elymian, for which we only have a very few hundred texts, most of them of one word or less, and therefore very limited material to actually disentangle the language, identify its roots and so on. Putting that properly in context with the contemporary archaic Greek material for a start should enable us to make rather more progress with that. If we break this down in a little bit more detail, just working back through the four periods again, if we look at the distribution of all inscriptions as we've catalogued them for archaic Sicily, where we have a split between Greek, Elymian, sickle and Punic in terms of quantities, one sees that once you add in the non-stone material, we get a much greater prevalence of epigraphic practice across parts of the interior of the island and not simply the coastal settlements of the Greek and Phoenician colonies, which is represented by the Greek material, but with a not insignificant penetration of Greek up into the interior in much of the southern half of the island. Whereas Elymian is entirely focused, primarily represented by a single cache of ceramic material from the site of Segesta, essentially a waste deposit of material thrown down from a sanctuary site above and preserved, and part of a challenging debate, shall we say, about how to determine whether the Elymians are a distinct people and how far, insofar as the texts provide the single best attestation of a distinct group beyond the late literary tradition that references them in the Greek and the Roman sources, because in other respects of material culture, they are not distinguishable from the surrounding communities by and large. Sickle, on the other hand, focuses very much in the interior of the southeast of the island with practices that reflect, uses of the Greek alphabet that reflect whichever was the nearest of the Greek colony cities in the region and so on. So you can trace clear patterns of influence in the adoption of writing in that pattern. One of the things that's striking about sickle, though, is that unlike Elymian, it does have a presence in monumental stone, and is picking that particular habitat seemingly from Syracuse and elsewhere, in contrast to the Elymians who are not doing so. So we have this monumental, it's 3 meters long, gate inscription from the interior site of Mendelito, for example. And Punic is then concentrated in the far west. One of the things I just invite you to think about is the extent to which the west of the island is much more linguistically diverse and has a much less consistent, as it were, epigraphic culture. I think that becomes relevant as we move on down through time. We have, if you like, the competition between different uses of Punic, Elymian, Greek, and so on. Moving into the Hellenistic period again, with this diffusion of epigraphic practice across the island, reflecting the increasingly urban monumentalization across the island. This is almost entirely Greek. So at this point, from circa 400 onwards, the evidence for sickle or Elymian has almost entirely disappeared, and Punic is extremely thin on the ground from this point onwards as well. Greek has, in that sense, as Diodorus says at one point at the end of this period and so on, the Sicilians had all ceased to be barbarians and called themselves Siciliotai, so on, presumably referring to precisely this take-up of Greek as a language and aspects of Greek epigraphic culture. Perhaps the interesting phenomenon in this period is the presence of Latin, and coming back to that earlier point, the extent to which Latin in the Republican period really focuses on the western end of the island. Syracuse is obviously the seat of the praetor and has the administrative centre, so one would expect some Latin to be turning up in Syracuse. We're talking about a tiny number of inscriptions for over 200 years of presence, but it predominates on that north coast facing towards Campania and the west. And one point to bear in mind, particularly if you think about this line of text running up through the middle, is that this is also the area which Rome was contesting primarily in both the First and the Second Punic Wars. It's an area which suffers very considerable, lots of the interior sites suffer destruction in the 3rd century BC in particular. So there's a lot of upheaval and transformation and rupture in continuity in these settlements, all of which I'd suggest, alongside what is the earliest surviving Roman milestone, provides a context for a rather different take-up over time, therefore, of epigraphic practices. And that is why I think one's got something very different going on in that part of the island as one moves on through time. When we move to the imperial period and it becomes a more predominantly coastal phenomenon, Greek is increasingly somewhat reduced across the coastal cities and is, if you like, reconcentrating down in the southeast of the island, particularly around Syracuse and Catania. Latin is a distinctively coastal phenomenon that can be seen to concentrate above all in the 6 veteran colonii that Augustus installs on the island. Not necessarily a great surprise, that's kind of probably what you'd be expecting, but very distinctively and visibly so, with the other key cities like Messana or Halysa being key coastal cities with strong connections back to the Italian mainland. When one moves into the late antique period and that increasing concentration down on the southeast, that to a significant degree reflects the fact that it's primarily Greek again. And so the Greek is, if you like, concentrating back into those key areas of Syracuse, Catania, but also this hinterland of the southeast of the island, while Latin is an increasingly diminishing phenomenon. And in this period, the key public texts are mostly in Greek and not in Latin at this point. So, and if you go into the Syracuse catacombs, 10% of the material is in Latin, 90% or so is in Greek. So it's very much the dominant language. Coming back to why does one do all of this, to an extent, or some of the things that one gets from doing this, I'm a very strong believer in trying to put the data together and make the data available. So I'll come back to that point at the end. But the fact that otherwise it's very hard to control what people say and to actually work out what is going on in a particular region. Arguably the principal greatest of the Sicilian epigraphists of the later 20th century through into the 21st was Giacomo Manganaro, professor of Greek epigraphy and history at Catania, who published hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions from Sicily, but is also therefore responsible for the primary discussions and analysis of this material through to the start of the 21st century. Famous paper where the conclusion is in the title, Greek in the villages and Latin in the cities in Roman Sicily between the 1st and 6th centuries AD, in which he presents some 50 inscriptions and uses these as the means to analyse what he thinks is going on in terms of linguistic practice. If you break them down and look at them, what you find is that they're entirely from the 3rd century onwards. There's nothing actually from the High Imperial period. And the vast majority of them are Latin and not Greek. And they all come from the southeast corner of the island. Whereas if you go back and look at the pattern of practice across the island in late antiquity, Latin has a not insignificant presence, although it's in small numbers in the rest of the island, but the numbers for Latin are tiny compared with the numbers for Greek. So it is a complete misrepresentation of the situation, but impossible to get at because almost none of that material was published in any standardized collection of any sort. By making this sort of corpus digital and with all the bibliographic references incorporated within that, it becomes possible to quickly produce this sort of analysis as well and actually find out what material people were basing their arguments on, those sorts of distributions. So and if you take that back to the map of inscriptions in Gualtherus, this potentially becomes a tool also therefore for a fairly detailed study of collecting practices, publishing practices, and the history of the study of the island as well. So all of this gets us to the point where we have a data set that we can do something with, hopefully, and start to explore in more diverse ways, whether that's linguistics, petrography, or paleography. And the ambition, if you like, was not simply to do each of these in isolation, but to think about the extent to which we could start to think about linguistic practice in relation to particular material choices or how materials affect paleographic style, or the extent to which materials change over time, reflecting particular practices, choices in epigraphic culture, and so on. And to hence the title, to try and interleave these different types of analysis to see what we can get as a picture as a whole, so that those maps are not simply limited to numbers by time in language, but we can start to break things down in more sophisticated ways. Probably one of the more ambitious sides to this was to actually get properly into serious linguistic analysis of the inscriptions. There is I can't do this. I leave these to the experts. But tree banking, dependency trees to reveal the syntactic structure, essentially, and so on. The bigger point. So Robert Crellin developed tools that would enable one to actually do this with a text. Victoria Fendel, coming in more recently, has done something similar with a corpus and has created a corpus of 700 inscriptions, which you can access through the Sketch Engine platform, which is an international platform for linguistic corpus analysis. The challenge with all of this is actually there are no epigraphic corpora out there which have been analysed in this way so far and been prepared to serve as linguistic corpora, which is to say that they've been marked up with the lemmatization, the word forms, the parts of speech, the morphology, and so on, so that you can actually, with a computer, start to do corpus linguistics on this. Now, these are small corpora, but none of them exist so far. The papyrologists do this quite extensively now with the papyri out of papyri.info and so on, but this hasn't yet happened with epigraphy. I think I now understand why. Despite EpiDoc, it's phenomenally hard to actually do it and make it work and get the data in a state where you can transform it to do that. And so we've got a partial data set at the end of this process. But it's still not something that you can do very automatically. And a lot of the automatic tools to do this, like to put lemmatization on it just to identify the word forms, fail miserably with epigraphic texts still, even in this world of AI. Just because it's a rather distinctive and very heterogeneous body of material, combined with the fact that they're often short and fragmentary, at which point you may argue that linguistic analysis isn't even worth it when they're fragmentary. So that there's a subset that you can work with. But there are real points of interest lurking within this, and trying to get at this in a more systematic way starts to become really interesting. So to take this example of 2nd, 3rd century AD funerary inscription, cinerary urn, simple square urn on local stone for a Gaius Matrinius Felicio, Latin name, Latin vocative, Gaia Matrini, but written in Greek. The final line, Choreste Chaia Mempte Chaira, is a very distinctive Syracusan Southeast Sicilian formula. You find it almost solely in this combination of Choreste Chaia Memptos in Southeast Sicily. So it's a distinctive local Greek marker from that point of view of early imperial funerary epigraphy here. But what is so distinctive about this one, besides the fact that we've got the Roman name using the Latin vocative written in Greek, is the fact that we've got this formula abbreviated, Latin style, which is not normal practice, and we've got interpuncts between every word, which also is a primary feature of Latin epigraphy, but not a primary feature of Greek epigraphy as a whole. So there's some real crossover going on just in terms of the practices involved in actually writing this, and I still actually wrestle with the question of whether this person is as it were, thought of themselves as first Greek-speaking or first Latin-speaking, because you could, as far as I can see, one could make quite cogent arguments in both directions. But it shows a real mix of the two. This particular case got us thinking about what could we say actually about abbreviation practice as a particular phenomenon that one might be able to explore in relation to epigraphic culture. And one of the nice things about EpiDoc is that one of the things it does encode very well and very fully is abbreviations. And so this is something you can actually get straight back out of your data set with a very simple bit of coding if you're Robert, not if you're me. This serves simply to show you, so the big column on the left is ones which have no inscript, no abbreviations in them. And then we have proportion of abbreviations to the overall text. So if it was 1, then every word in the text would be abbreviated. Whereas when we're down at sort of 0.1 or whatever, then it probably means only one word in the text was abbreviated. So the headline from this for the island as a whole is that abbreviation is a much more common practice in Latin. 75% of texts have abbreviation versus only 25% of texts in Greek. Now, that probably fits with your assumptions that we would generally say abbreviation is a Latin epigraphic culture, and it's not something the Greeks do. It tends to be overstated. Greek epigraphy does actually include abbreviations more than people often allow for. The Hellenistic period is particularly nice for this. Numbers are fairly small, but if one drills down to that, we see the fact that basically every Latin inscription on Sicily had an abbreviation in it. That's the orange here is, if you think back to the Hellenistic map, is our distribution of Latin inscriptions. But there is a swathe of inscriptions that have abbreviations in Greek in this period, though the number is tiny. We're talking about 20 or so from within the corpus of 380, 400 Greek inscriptions. But one can see a very different set of practices within this. So the primary abbreviations in the Greek material versus the primary abbreviations in the Latin material. The headline is you just need to look for the number of red arrows, because the red arrows point to onomastic elements that have been abbreviated. And of course, one reason why abbreviation is so prevalent in Latin numerically is just the practice of abbreviating names. And we've got a number of those Latin names creeping across into the Greek inscriptions in the Republican period already. But high prevalence of particular institutional terms that are actually abbreviated in a small number of Greek inscriptions. So words for plots of land, words for particular magistrates, and so on. There is a practice of its own that is different from the Latin practice out there. When we come to the imperial period, and here we just present the ones which have abbreviations. So in imperial period Sicily, we can see that there's anything up to, and the peak is probably around 40% there, in terms of, so 40% of words in the average Latin, and it's obviously mostly funerary inscriptions, are abbreviated, whereas it's only about 20-25% in a smaller proportion overall of texts. So it's a less prevalent phenomenon in Greek, as we would expect. That pattern changes somewhat when we move to late antiquity, where it drops off significantly, actually, even in the surviving Latin inscriptions. The pattern of abbreviation reduces, while the volume of abbreviation increases. Not drastically, in fact. The nature of the plot is slightly misleading, but there is a shift in practice and an increase in practice in the Greek inscriptions of the late antique period, which is very nicely illustrated, I think, by the one inscription from Sicily which illustrates every possible form of abbreviation on the island. On the island that you can use. So if you study abbreviations, you classify them according to whether they're suspension abbreviations or contraction abbreviations or reduplication abbreviations. So whether the end of the word is lost, the middle of the word is lost, or whether you reduplicate the final consonant or some other element. And this has everything, whether it's a double sigma for Sebastone, the loss of letters from the middle here and with abbreviation markers, or just the loss of the end and so on. The only inscription in which that happens from Sicily is a later late antique funerary inscription. So one might make the argument that there's a shift happening in practice, influenced by Latin practice over time into the epigraphy of later antiquity. One could attempt to do this as a comparative study as well. I'm going to skip over this because it doesn't get one very far at this point, but for it you require other data sets in EpiDoc, and there aren't very many. Conveniently, you might say Tripolitania and Cyrenaica have been encoded by the projects of Charlotte Rouchet and others in EpiDoc, so we've got a Latin and a Greek corpus just south of Sicily that might allow us to draw some comparisons. The headline would be the Latin habit looks broadly the same as the Latin habit in Tripolitania in terms of patterns of abbreviation, but the Greek in Sicily does look significantly different from the very limited and scattered erratic practice in Cyrenaica. So something different is happening in Sicily in the Greek abbreviation practice, which I would argue is probably going to be influenced by this bilingualism in the east of the island in relation to Syracuse and elsewhere. Second strand was paleography. Very well-established, long-running traditional discipline in epigraphy, most frequently used inevitably in an attempt to provide a date when all other means fail. And my main reason for pursuing this in origin, I have to say, was a healthy degree of skepticism and kind of wanting to prove that you couldn't do this, and that if we systematically collected the data on letter forms, we would show that most of the assertions about dates based on letter forms for Sicilian inscriptions were, at best, optimistic. Whether that's true or not is still a little bit too early to say, because Simona has been working with King's Digital Lab just down the road from here on developing a very sophisticated tool that was built originally for medieval paleography to trace scribal hands in medieval manuscripts. It allows one to link the letter on the image to the letter in the EpiDoc text and to provide a description of it based on a systematic standardized form of descriptions so that you can build up a comprehensive set of annotations that you can then search and analyze. So you start by describing the structure of specific letters. So what are the key components that are always going to be present in a particular form, say an alpha or something of that sort. You move on to describe the things that can vary, the features within that. So is the crossbar broken or is it sloping? So on, these different variants that you find. And working from that bottom-up description, you end up with a set of types of different letter forms that you can then build up an annotation set. So Simona's been working hard and has done 4,000 or so annotations when this slide was made, which was a little while ago, working through, at the moment, chosen inscriptions, classify. And having built that annotation set up, the point is you can then filter and search for it. So you can essentially say, in Greek, show me all examples of alpha where the crossbar is broken, which is regularly used within Sicilian Hellenistic epigraphy as a diagnostic to try and assert where this thing falls in many of these undatable inscriptions, which will give you back every example that you've collected of broken bar alpha. And the end point in this particular case study was with a deeply fragmentary public text from the theatre of Montellato, which has several building phrases. This must pertain to one of them, but which, and paleography is just about your only bet, and actually there's enough material coming together to make it pretty confident that this belongs to the building phase that the archaeologists would put circa 200 BC and so on, rather than the one either side, and that's progress already. I suspect the greater value in a lot of this is less about that particular aspect and more about spotting regional patterns as a whole. So in the way that it's fairly clear in the Archaic period that Sickle and Elimian usage is heavily influenced by the nearest Greek polis, for example, so on, so that you can trace patterns of letter forms regionally, not necessarily so accurately chronologically, but you can see regional use. I'm particularly interested in the potential correlations actually of letter forms to material type, looking ahead to the last sub-package, and the extent to which the type of material you're carving on deeply affects actually the sorts of letter forms you can produce. And of course, one has the potential to spot local workshops, and that's become very clear already that whether it's in the catacombs or in certain of the colonia, you start to see very particular local forms and practices. Last package, we're nearly there. Alessia Coccato has been working for 3.5 years now, 3 years, on the petrographic analysis of the inscriptions. So this is where we get into proper hard science in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Catania, Giovanna Barone and Paolo Mazzoleni, attempting to undertake portable XRF chemical analysis of the stone alongside digital microscopy, and for about 10% of the material, and with the very helpful support of our Sicilian colleagues, actual physical samples, which can then be both thin-sectioned but also subjected to other forms of analysis. For instance, for the marbles, we're doing quite a lot of isotope analysis and so on. I think at the latest count, she's got approximately 280 physical samples and done chemical analysis on over 800, which gets us well up towards this very substantial sample size, and those are obviously largely targeted choices. This has a value far beyond epigraphy in terms of what this will give us for Sicily as a petrographic data set as a whole, so for the use of material. And she's also pursuing her own interest, which is specifically in pigments, which I'll come back to briefly at the end. This has very simple, obvious applications. One of the most famous Hellenistic texts from Sicily is this fragment of a royal letter and oath, almost certainly to be attributed to the reign of Hieron II in Syracuse in the 3rd century BC, a hint of what we've lost, by and large, of the Hellenistic epigraphy of Syracuse, but where the stone, which seems quite distinctive, has been from the outset described as pietra scura, pietra nera, and has led to speculations ranging from not simply limestone to some form of marble to granite, and proposals that it comes from Greece or from Egypt, and questions around why is Hieron importing granite from Egypt and so on. It's actually just a limestone, and we haven't located exactly where in Sicily it comes from, but it is almost certainly a Sicilian limestone. The other major bases from Hieron's use come from the area of Taormina, and so there's a selective regional use of stone, but Hieron is not importing weird dark stones from Egypt and that sort of thing, so on, tempting as that might be. More broadly, this relates to a basic point, which is that Sicily doesn't have native marble in the geological sense of the term. It has polishable stones, but it doesn't have native marble. And to use marble, therefore, you have to import it. That's obviously significant, requires additional expenditure and so on. And one can see a very straightforward. So grey is inscriptions not in marble. Blue is Greek on marble, and orange is Latin on marble. So what one almost immediately sees is a tiny use of imported marble in the Hellenistic period, huge increase in the use of marble, primarily by those Romans in their Latin inscriptions in the imperial period, and then a shift back so that the rise again in Greek epigraphy is taking place on marble. A large proportion of that late antique marble is actually reuse of building marble from the earlier period, so on. So that the main period of importation, the main use of marble, you can argue about whether this is because those inscribing in Latin felt that it was necessary to inscribe on marble and therefore went to efforts to import it, or whether this is in part a broader consequence of the increased connectivity and availability of marble. The two things are obviously interconnected through this period. But you can see a very clear shift in preferences through the late Hellenistic and into the Roman period. So if we go to Halysa on the north coast, which becomes somewhere which from the Augustan period onwards inscribes, there is essentially a flick of a switch, and they start inscribing in Latin from the Augustan period, having been inscribing Italian Greek before. But we start by using very much just the local stone, which is coarse and readily available. We switch to something for public texts in the course of the later Hellenistic period that comes from maybe 40, 50 kilometres down the coast and is as close as they can get to something that's reasonably fine and will take a fine, small lettered text in detail, but it's fairly soft still. The moment we switch across the Augustan period, we move to imported marble, so on, but not before. And when you start to put all these things together, you start to get, much like our Gaius Matrinius earlier, text that sits right on the, as it were, Republic imperial boundary, where we have a text in nice serifed Greek, which again is using interpuncts, and particularly distinctive hollow triangular interpuncts that in Sicily seem to be a fundamentally Augustan phenomenon by and large, particularly across the north coast. And it's using this regional text imported from some 50, 60 kilometres away, in contrast to most of what's been used for this sort of text up to that point. So, plus we've got an individual with clearly Italic Roman name, Marcus Aemilius, we think Rodon's son of Kippos, so some Oscan speakers or Oscan onomastics creeping in, so on. So working in Greek, but again shifting towards more visibly Latin Roman epigraphic practices. Final point within materiality. Alessia basically said, are we interested in pigments at one point? And it was sort of, pigments? Oh, rubrication. Well, yes. Which turns out to fundamentally lack any systematic study at all, as far as I can discover. It's almost in single digits, the number of publications you can find that involve any modern analysis of pigment in inscriptions. And indeed, amusingly, in a number of cases when it is done, it's been done entirely for the purposes of facilitating the reading of the text by looking for the traces of the mineral or the metal that might show you where the letters are, with no actual interest in the fact that this reflects a particular use of colour and so on in the discussion. One particularly seemingly unimpressive little example, which is a pair of fragments from the stores in the museum in Syracuse, which turn out to have cinnabar, which is the most expensive of the red pigments. It's one in Diocletian's Prices Edict and so on, and this is going for expensive red. There are lots of cheaper ways of doing red. There's actual minium, which is the modern term for minium. Confusingly, Pliny calls cinnabar minium, whereas minium is red lead oxide. As it were, when we use the term minium, so it doesn't help in the literature. There's a confusion there. But there are lots of cheaper ways to do red, basically, whether it's lead oxide or iron-based pigments, so on. So you've made a deliberate choice and you've spent a lot of money in order to have the letters painted in red cinnabar. This was an unmarked fragment with no connections to anything sitting in a box. And when Alessia found two fragments with cinnabar on them, and there aren't very many with cinnabar on, it became possible to say, wait a minute, these must go together. And in fact, we then found that they joined, having been in completely separate boxes elsewhere and so on. And it also moves you towards the idea that actually this is a 2nd, 3rd century public text of some description, not the fragment of a funerary inscription that we probably would have just ignored it as. Not that we can do very much with 3.5 letters, but it immediately raises the state of what's going on. But the potential for actually starting to systematically look at the choices and uses of colour across this, quite apart from the choices and uses of stone and the combinations thereof, is looking extremely promising, I'll put it that way, essentially. Also, mostly requires somebody going around with a microscope, because by and large the traces are almost entirely lost, and there's a whole set of complications about the practice of repainting from about the 16th, 17th century onwards. You can distinguish very often because modern pigments are often fundamentally different chemically from ancient ones, and so on. So it's possible to determine that, but it complicates the practice of actually working it out. But there's an awful lot of work basically still to be done, way beyond Sicily, on this as a particular phenomenon. I should wrap up. The only things I'd sort of finish by saying are that getting all this material together and working on it provides great opportunities for actually working locally with actually getting this material on display, helping with exhibitions and making it more accessible, not just online but in person. And a lot of the fun has actually been working with both school students and university students in Catania and Palermo and elsewhere in Siracusa, partly because I cannot do it all by myself, and so training up a bunch of graduate students and so on. Catania and Palermo is a great way of getting more inscriptions catalogued more quickly. And very lastly, sort of coming full circle, I did this back in 2002, and I built up my own private data set, and it was great. And for about 5-10 years, I got to go and give papers on Sicilian epigraphy because nobody else had this data set. And it was just me, and I could hang on to it and so on. And I had it in a horrendous access table that was all my own and so on. And at a certain point, as it were, got the fair bug, if you like, because having realized that firstly you could put it online, but you could also make it accessible. Partly this is about precisely the point that if I make a claim about it, you can go away and check. You can look at the material for yourself. Any of these claims should be checkable and reproducible. But there's a bigger issue about actually trying to make this epigraphic data more usable as a whole. So to come back to that abbreviation practice, if I actually want to see what's going on with Sicilian material, I need to be able to compare it with what's going on in Italy or elsewhere across the Mediterranean. That's becoming possible, but we're not yet at the point where either data is open enough, or if it is open enough, it's in a standardized form that you can actually compare your two different data sets, so on. So there's still an awful lot of work to be done on that. But one of the really nice outcomes has been, and I think it's a nice outcome, I have these odd moments of reverting to, that's mine, give it back. But it is a nice outcome. So a student, not of the ancient world at all, wrote to me over the summer and said, don't know what you think about this. He basically downloaded the data and put it into a semantic search engine, AI powered. It's fantastic. I mean, if you want to write the web address down and so on, but you can put any word you like into it and it will spit back out inscriptions that it thinks from the basis of the data in the files pertain to that word. And it will generate a not impossible translation for the ones we haven't translated yet either, as well as summarizing the metadata, just like your AI-driven Google search will do these days and so on. It clearly didn't take them very long. And other people have started using the data to actually do specific studies, in this case where I then worked with them to do it, but adding in this extensible markup to actually pursue markup about emperors and imperial honorifics so that you have a distinctive study of imperial honorific practice. So there's an awful lot more to do. We haven't finished the analysis yet, but other people are probably going to get there ahead of us at this rate. But that is all to the good, and I've talked quite enough. Thank you.